1. The structure of torture. The conversion of real pain into the fiction of power. Nowhere is the sadistic potential of a language built on agency so visible as in torture. While torture contains language, specific human words and sounds, it is itself a language, an objectification, an acting out. Real pain, agonizing pain, is inflicted on a person, but torture, which contains specific acts of inflicting pain, is also itself a demonstration and magnification of the felt experience of pain. In the very processes it uses to produce pain within the body of the prisoner, it bestows visibility on the structure and enormity of what is usually private and incommunicable, contained within the boundaries of the sufferer's body. It then goes on to deny, to falsify, the reality of the very thing it has itself objectified by a perceptual shift which converts the vision of suffering into the wholly illusory but, to the torturers and the regime they represent, wholly convincing spectacle of power. The physical pain is so incontestably real that it seems to confer its quality of incontestable reality on that power that has brought it into being. It is, of course, precisely because the reality of that power is so highly contestable, the regime so unstable, that torture is being used. Point 1. What assists the conversion of absolute pain into the fiction of absolute power is an obsessive, self-conscious display of agency. On the simplest level, the agent displayed is the weapon. Testimony given by torture victims from many different countries almost inevitably includes descriptions of being made to stare at the weapon with which they were about to be hurt. Prisoners of the Greek junta, 1967-71, for example, were made to contemplate a wall arrangement of whips, canes, clubs, and rods, were made to examine the size of the torturer's fist and the monogrammed ring which he wore and which made his blows more painful, or were compelled to look at a bull's pizzle coated with the dried blood of a fellow prisoner. Point 2. But whatever the regime's primary weapon, it is only one of many weapons and its display is only one of many endlessly multiplied acts of display. Torture is a process which not only converts but announces the conversion of every conceivable aspect of the event and the environment into an agent of pain. It is not accidental that in the torturer's idiom the room in which the brutality occurs was called the production room in the Philippines 3, the cinema room in South Vietnam 4, and the blue lit stage in Chile 5, built on these repeated acts of display and having as its purpose the production of a fantastic illusion of power. Torture is a grotesque piece of compensatory drama. Moral stupidity, then, here as in its less savage and obscene forms, has an unconscious structure. Torture is in its largest outlines the invariable and simultaneous occurrence of three phenomena which, if isolated into separate and sequential steps, would occur in the following order. First, pain is inflicted on a person in ever-intensifying ways. Second, the pain, continually amplified within the person's body, is also amplified in the sense that it is objectified, made visible to those outside the person's body. Third, the objectified pain is denied as pain and read as power, a translation made possible by the obsessive mediation of agency. The workings of these three phenomena will very gradually emerge during the following description of the place of body and voice in torture. Pain and interrogation. Torture consists of a primary physical act, the infliction of pain, and a primary verbal act, the interrogation. The first rarely occurs without the second. As is true of the present period, most historical episodes of torture, such as the Inquisition, have inevitably included the element of interrogation. The pain is traditionally accompanied by the question. Ancient history, too, confirms the insistent coupling. Strangers caught by the Icha cults in India, for example, were sacrificed after being subjected to a series of riddles. Point 6. The connection between the physical act and the verbal act, between body and voice, is often misstated or misunderstood. Although the information sought in an interrogation is almost never credited with being a just motive for torture, it is repeatedly credited with being the motive for torture. But for every instance in which someone with critical information is interrogated, there are hundreds interrogated who could know nothing of remote importance to the stability or self-image of the regime. Point 7. Just as within a precarious regime the motive for arrest is often a fiction, the exiler's eggs were too small grease ate, and just as the motive for punishing those imprisoned is often a fiction, the men, although locked in their cells, watched and applauded the television report that a military plane had crashed Chile 9, so what masquerades as the motive for torture is a fiction. The idea that the need for information is the motive for the physical cruelty arises from the tone and form of the questioning rather than from its content. The questions, no matter how contemptuously irrelevant their content, are announced, delivered, as though they motivated the cruelty, as if the answers to them were crucial. Few other moments of human speech so conflate the modes of the interrogatory, the declarative, the imperative, as well as the emphatic form of each of these three, the exclamatory. Each mode implies a radically different relation of speaker to listener, and so the rapid slipping and colliding of these voices and the relations they imply the independence of the declarative, the uncertain dependence of the interrogatory, the dominance of the imperative, each as though unaccompanied and unqualified by the others, raised to its most absolute in the urgency of the exclamatory suggest a level of instability so extreme that the questioner might seem involved in the outcome to the very extent of its being. In fact, when this kind of conflation occurs in private, non-political human speech, and where it is unaccompanied by physical brutality, when, say, a jealous lover or a terrified parent asks questions and asserts the answers in a way that rocks between utterly self-sufficient conviction and a pleading need of the listener's crediting or confirmation, the person may well be involved in the response to the very extent of his or her being. But as the content and context of the torturer's questions make clear, the fact that something is asked as if the content of the answer matters does not mean that it matters. It is crucial to see that the interrogation does not stand outside an episode of torture as its motive or justification. It is internal to the structure of torture, exists there because of its intimate connections to and interactions with the physical pain. Pain and interrogation inevitably occur together in part because the torturer and the prisoner each experience them as opposites. The very question that, within the political pretense, matters so much to the torturer that it occasions his grotesque brutality will matter so little to the prisoner experiencing the brutality that he will give the answer. For the torturers, the sheer and simple fact of human agony is made invisible, and the moral fact of inflicting that agony is made neutral by the faint urgency and significance of the question. For the prisoner, the sheer, simple, overwhelming fact of his agony will make neutral and invisible the significance of any question as well as the significance of the world to which the question refers. Intense pain is world-destroying. In compelling confession, the torturers compel the prisoner to record and objectify the fact that intense pain is world-destroying. It is for this reason that while the content of the prisoner's answer is only sometimes important to the regime, the form of the answer, the fact of his answering, is always crucial. There is not only among torturers but even among people appalled by acts of torture and sympathetic to those who are, a covert disdain for confession. This disdain is one of many manifestations of how inaccessible the reality of physical pain is to anyone not immediately experiencing it. Point 10. The nature of confession is falsified by an idiom built on the word betrayal. In confession, one betrays oneself and all those aspects of the world, friend, family, country, cause that the self is made up of. The inappropriateness of this idiom is immediately apparent in any non-political context. It is a commonplace that at the moment when a dentist's drill hits and holds an exposed nerve, a person sees stars. What is meant by seeing stars is that the contents of consciousness are, during those moments, obliterated, that the name of one's child, the memory of a friend's face, are all absent asterisk, but the nature of this absence is not illuminated by the word betrayal. One cannot betray or be false to something that has ceased to exist and, in the most literal way possible, the created world of thought and feeling, all the psychological and mental content that constitutes both oneself and one's world, and that gives rise to and is in turn made possible by language, ceases to exist. For the most part, neither actual nor fictional accounts of torture focus on the process of disintegrating perception brought about by great pain and objectified in confession. Sartre's short story The Wall is a partial description of the process. The story begins shortly before a prisoner of the fascist government in Spain learns that he has been sentenced to be executed, and it ends shortly after he learns that his death sentence has been, at least temporarily, reversed. For a moment his sudden reprieve seemed senseless. When the regime had offered him his life in return for information about the hiding place of a friend, he had ensured his own death by naming a false location. In the final sentences of the story, he learns that his friend has been captured in the spot he named. From this description one might assume that The Wall closes with a sense of crushing irony. The ending is almost a paradigm of ironic structures in its quick series of reversals. The expectation of execution gives way to sudden reprieve, the relief of reprieve gives way to a recognition of its cost. In its coupling of opposites, the seriousness of betrayal is brought about by the banality of gratuitous coincidence, and in its insistent exposure of the limits of awareness, what the prisoner understood himself to be concealing he was instead exposing, the realm in which his will could operate, which he assessed to be and accepted as being very, very small, was in fact far smaller. But the ending is almost wholly without ironic impact, although anyone while reading will probably recognize as though from a great distance that the final events have a rhythm that would ordinarily make the mind wince, contract, even for a moment shut down. The actual response will probably be closer to a shrug. The utter flatness of the closing is indicative of is in fact a way of allowing us to see our own participation in the state of consciousness the story describes, a state that has at its center the single, overwhelming discrepancy between an increasingly palpable body and an increasingly substanceless world, a discrepancy that makes all the lesser discrepancies we normally identify as ironic seem as remote and full of dissolution as the world to which they belong. Point 11. Pablo Eviata's experience in The Wall is close to if not identical with that of a person subjected to great pain. He is not tortured. He comments quickly at one point that if tortured he would certainly give the information asked. But he is sentenced to be executed, and is then suddenly released, and so in fact goes what has been in the recent past a form of torture common in places like Chile, Brazil, Greece, and the Philippines, the mock execution, or, as it was called in the Philippines, the process of dying. Of course, no particular form of torture is required to make visible the kinship between pain and death, both of which are radical and absolute, found only at the boundaries they themselves create. That pain is so frequently used as a symbolic substitute for death in the initiation rites of many tribes. 12 is surely attributable to an intuitive human omission that pain is the equivalent in felt experience of what is unfeelable in death. Each only happens because of the body. In each, the contents of consciousness are destroyed. The two are the most intense forms of negation, the purest expressions of the anti-human, of annihilation, of total aversiveness, though one is an absence and the other a felt presence, one occurring in the cessation of sentience, the other expressing itself in grotesque overload. Regardless, then, of the context in which it occurs, physical pain always mimes death, and the infliction of physical pain is always a mock execution. The moment in which Pablo Eviata learns he is to be shot the next morning by a firing squad is the moment once described by George Eliot as that in which a person's general awareness all men must die is displaced by the specific awareness, I must die and soon. Whenever death can be designated as soon, the dying has already begun. Eviata is dying not because he has yet experienced the damage that will end his life, but because he has begun to experience the body that will end his life, the body that can be killed, and which when killed will carry away the conditions that allow him to exist. Throughout the night that leads up to the morning of the scheduled execution, his body alternates somewhat aimlessly between two forms of calling attention to itself. At times it expresses itself in a heightened sensitivity and burning cheeks 13 or in a disturbingly acute sense of smell 8. At other times it asserts its presence through a greatly diminished sensitivity, no longer signaling him when it sweats 6. Or urinates 12. For neither Eviata nor Sartre is there anything intriguingly paradoxical or even puzzling about this duality. The two simply belong together, exist uncommented upon side by side. Eviata's body is full of pains like a crowd of tiny scats. 8. The body is its pains, a shrill sentience that hurts and is hugely alarmed by its hurt, and the body is its scars, thick and forgetful, unmindful of its hurt, unmindful of anything, mute and insensate. The body, this intensely carrot and sometimes, as in pain, obscenely alive tissue is also the thing that allows Eviata, or anyone, to be one day dead. Eviata perceives the body as an enormous vermin to which he is tied. 12. A colossus to which he is bound but with which he feels no kinship. In its huge, heavy presence, the rest of the world grows light, as though all else has been upended and emptied of its contents. What was full is now an outline, a sketch, a caricature. Spain and anarchy, dramatic realities a few days earlier, are now without immediacy and meaning. Nor is his sense of country and cause revitalized. By his face-to-face confrontation with his enemy interrogators, he describes their gestures, dress, opinions, and acts as looking ludicrously small, shocking and burlesque. 15. Rather than feeling angered at their ideology or their brutality, he feels embarrassed by their seriousness, their silly and sententious ignorance of their own mortality. This loss of country and conviction is only one of many signs of the new weightlessness of world and self. The woman he loved, the woman who a single day earlier had so pressed upon his consciousness that words of affectionate description had spilled forth from him even when there was no appropriate listener present, is now so irrecoverably remote that he rejects the chance to speak the few words of a farewell message. 11. Even the physical objects in his prison cell, the most immediate and concrete objects of consciousness, have been emptied of their content, have each become a mere sketch. Bench, lamp, and coal pile, Eviata comments, had a funny look. They were more obliterated, less dense than usual. 12. The narration as a whole also has the quality of a sketch. The experience it describes is utterly clear in its outline, but all the emotional edges have been eliminated, absorbed into a surface as uniform and undifferentiated as Eviata's world, Eviata's wall. For the reader, the fear of the matter has been replaced by the simple fact of the matter, except perhaps at the periphery of vision where one is still able to apprehend, at least for a few seconds at a time, not merely the empty outline but the speed and force and direction of the events described, the crisis of world collapse that is taking place. The objects of consciousness from the most expansive to the most intimate, from those that exist in the space at the very limits of vision to those that exist in the space immediately outside the boundaries of the body, from the Big Dipper down to Spain and in through the realm of personal memories to the most abiding objects of love and belief. And arriving finally at the bench beneath him and the coal pile at his feet, all in one patient rush are swept through and annihilated. It is in part the horrible momentum of this world contraction that is mirrored in the sudden agonized grimace of a person overcome by great pain or by the recognition of imminent death. The process of perception Sartre describes, obviously not dependent on a political context, belongs anywhere where death is near and so belongs to aging. Sometimes assisted by younger human beings, the body works to obliterate the world and self of the old person. Something of this world dissolution is already at work even in the tendency of those in late middle age, no longer working, to see their former jobs, their life actions, their choices as wrong or trivial, jobs, actions, and choices that are probably no more insignificant than a Beatas Spain but that seem insignificant by virtue of the same process, though these people may only be at the beginning of what he has almost finished. As the body breaks down, it becomes increasingly the object of attention, usurping the place of all other objects, so that finally, in very very old and sick people, the world may exist only in a circle 2 feet out from themselves. The exclusive content of perception and speech may become what was eaten, the problems of excreting, the progress of pains, the comfort or discomfort of a particular chair or bed. Stravinsky once described aging as the ever-shrinking perimeter of pleasure. This constantly diminishing world ground is almost a given in representations of old age. As a Beatas bench dissolves beneath him, so the ground beneath the old grows insubstantial, ceases to belong to them. 14 Sophocles' Oedipus, forbidden from entering his homeland. Thebes is also violator and trespasser of the ground at Colonus. Shakespeare's Lear, having at last after long humiliation consented to enter the small but shareable space of a cage, stands instead alone on the narrow edge of a country and a cliff. Beckett's Winnie, the most literal victim of Stravinsky's ever shrinking perimeter, is caught by a piece of ground that has snapped shut around her waist and that soon will close on the smaller circle of her neck. Each of these plays, though dense with other meanings, is in part the dramatization of the struggle to stay alive, to stay a little, to maintain one's extension out into the world, whether that world, that self-extension, resides in a full-sized revenue or in a handbag full of familiar objects, in a young city's need of an elder's blessing or in, most simply, your beautiful child. 15 For each of the three, the voice becomes a final source of self-extension, so long as one is speaking, the self extends out beyond the boundaries of the body, occupies a space much larger than the body. 16 It is not accidental that a substantial part of the power of each play is its verbal virtuosity, that these old people talk so much, that for each the tour de force is less a display of style than a mode of survival, whether it is Oedipus's highly charged alternation between the ritualized past and future of confession and oath, or Lear's commands, pleas, shrieks, his howling noise, or Winnie's brave duckings. Their ceaseless talk articulates their unspoken understanding that only in silence do the edges of the self become coterminous with the edges of the body it will die with. As in dying and death, so in serious pain the claims of the body utterly nullify the claims of the world. The annihilating power of pain is visible in the simple fact of experience observed by Karl Marx. There is only one antidote to mental suffering, and that is physical pain. 17 A pronouncement whose premises are only slightly distorted in Oscar Wilde's God spare me physical pain and I'll take care of the moral pain myself. 18 As though in anticipation of a century that would produce out of its own physical well-being, or the well-being of its most articulate class, an endless fascination with the details of psychic distress and dislocation, the 19th century periodically reminded itself and its heirs of the privileges implicit in madness, whether that reminder took the form of aphorism, as in Marx and Wilde, or was expanded into narrative, as in George Eliot's Arthur Donithard, who notices petulantly that physical pain might lift him out of his own self-absorbed boredom long enough to help him avoid damaging himself, a very young woman, and the hierarchical norms of their community. 19 Whereas in Emile Zola's Monsieur Hannibal, who recognizes that his obsessive sorrow about his unfulfilled marriage would be instantly eliminated if, like the coal miners, his empty belly were twisted with pains that made his brain reel. 20 Physical pain is able to obliterate psychological pain because it obliterates all psychological content, painful, pleasurable, and neutral. Our recognition of its power to end madness is one of the ways in which, knowingly or unknowingly, we acknowledge its power to end all aspects of self and world. Another manifestation of this power is its continual reappearance in religious experience. The self-flagellation of the religious ascetic, for example, is not, as is often asserted, an act of denying the body, eliminating its claims from attention, but a way of so emphasizing the body that the contents of the world are cancelled and the path is clear for the entry of an unworldly, contentless force. It is in part this world-ridding, path-clearing logic that explains the obsessive presence of pain in the rituals of large, widely shared religions as well as in the imagery of intensely private visions, that partly explains why the crucifixion of Christ is at the center of Christianity, why so many primitive forms of worship climax in pain ceremonies, why Bronte's Wuthering Heights is built on the principle first announced in Lockwood's Dream that the pilgrim's staff is also a cudgel, what even Wisman's famous dandy recognizes in his Sieges of Great Pain a susceptibility to religious conversion, why in the brilliant ravings of art taught some ultimate and essential principle of reality can be compelled down from the heavens onto a theater stage by the mime of cruelty, why, though it occurs in widely different contexts and cultures, the metaphysical is insistently coupled with the physical with the equally insistent exclusion of the middle term, world. The position of the person who is tortured is in many ways, of course, radically different from that of the person who experiences pain in a religious context, or that of an old person facing death, or that of the person who is hurt in a dentist's office. One simple and essential difference is duration. Although a dentist's drill may in fact be the torturer's instrument, it will not land on a nerve for the eternity of a few seconds but for the eternity of the uncountable number of seconds that make up the period of torture, a period that may be 17 hours on a single day or 4 hours a day on each of 29 days. A second difference is control. The person tortured does not will his entry into and withdrawal out of the pain as the religious communicant enters and leaves the pain of a Good Friday meditation, or as the patient enters and leaves the pain of the healing therapy. A third difference is purpose. The path of worldly objects is swept clean. Not, as in religion, to make room for the approach of some divinely intuited force, nor, as in medicine and dentistry, to repair the ground for the return of the world itself. There is in torture not even a fragment of a benign explanation as there is in old age, where the absence of the world from oneself can be understood as an experienceable inversion of the eventual but unexperienceable absence of oneself from the world. Perhaps only in the prolonged and searing pain caused by accident or by disease or by the breakdown of the pain pathway itself is there the same brutal senselessness as in torture. But these other non-political contexts are called upon because they make immediately self-evident a central fact about pain that, although emphatically present in torture, is also obscured there by the idiom of betrayal. It is the intense pain that destroys a person's self and world, a destruction experienced spatially as either the contraction of the universe down to the immediate vicinity of the body or as the body swelling to fill the entire universe. Intense pain is also language destroying, as the content of one's world disintegrates, so the content of one's language disintegrates, as the self disintegrates, so that which would express and project the self is robbed of its source and its subject. World, self, and voice are lost, or nearly lost, through the intense pain of torture and not through the confession as is wrongly suggested by its connotations of betrayal. The prisoner's confession merely objectifies the fact of their being almost lost, makes their invisible absence, or nearby absence, visible to the torturers. To assent to words that through the thick agony of the body can be only dimly heard, or to reach aimlessly for the name of a person or a place that has barely enough cohesion to hold its shape as a word and none to bond it to its worldly referent, is a way of saying, yes, all is almost gone now, there is almost nothing left now, even this voice, the sounds I am making, no longer form my words but the words of another. Torture, then, to return for a moment to the starting point, consists of a primary physical act, the infliction of pain, and a primary verbal act, the interrogation. The verbal act, in turn, consists of two parts, the question and the answer, each with conventional connotations that wholly falsify it. The question is mistakenly understood to be the motive, the answer is mistakenly understood to be the betrayal. The first mistake credits the torturer, providing him with a justification, his cruelty with an explanation. The second discredits the prisoner, making him rather than the torturer, his voice rather than his pain, the cause of his loss of self and world. These two misinterpretations are obviously neither accidental nor unrelated. The one is an absolution of responsibility, the other is a conferring of responsibility. The two together turn the moral reality of torture upside down. Almost anyone looking at the physical act of torture would be immediately appalled and repulsed by the torturers. It is difficult to think of a human situation in which the lines of moral responsibility are more starkly or simply drawn, in which there is a more compelling reason to ally one's sympathies with the one person and to repel the claims of the other. Yet as soon as the focus of attention shifts to the verbal aspect of torture, those lines have begun to waver and change their shape in the direction of accommodating and crediting the torturers. Point 21 This inversion, this interruption, and redirecting of a basic moral reflex, is indicative of the kind of interactions occurring between body and voice in torture and suggests why the infliction of acute physical pain is inevitably accompanied by the interrogation. However near the prisoner, the torturer stands, the distance between their physical realities is colossal, for the prisoner is in overwhelming physical pain while the torturer is utterly without pain. He is free of any pain originating in his own body, he is also free of the pain originating in the agonized body so near him. He is so without any human recognition of or identification with the pain that he is not only able to bear its presence but able to bring it continually into the present, inflicted asterisk sustain it, minute after minute, hour after hour. Although the distance separating the two is probably the greatest distance that can separate two human beings, it is an invisible distance since the physical realities it lies between are each invisible. The prisoner experiences an annihilating negation so hugely felt throughout his own body that it overflows into the spaces before his eyes and in his ears and mouth, yet one which is unfelt, unsensed by anybody else. The torturer experiences the absence of this annihilating negation. These physical realities, an annihilating negation and an absence of negation, are therefore translated into verbal realities in order to make the invisible distance visible, in order to make what is taking place in terms of pain take place in terms of power, in order to shift what is occurring exclusively in the mode of sentience into the mode of self-extension and world. The torturer's questions asked, shouted, insisted upon, pleaded for objectify the fact that he has a world, announce in their faint urgency the critical importance of that world, a world whose asserted magnitude is confirmed by the cruelty it is able to motivate and justify. Part of what makes its world so huge is its continual juxtaposition with the small and shredded world objectified in the prisoner's answers that articulate and comment on the disintegration of all objects, to which he might have been bonded in loyalty or love or good sense or long familiarity. It is only the prisoner's steadily shrinking ground that wins for the torturer his swelling sense of territory. The question and the answer are a prolonged comparative display, an unfurling of world maps. This display of worlds can alternatively be understood as a display of selves or a display of voices, for the three are close to being a single phenomenon. The vocabulary of motive and betrayal, for example, is itself an indication of a perceived difference in selfhood. To credit the torturer with having a motive is, among other things, to credit him with having psychic content, the very thing the prisoner's confession acknowledges the absence of and which the idiom of betrayal accuses him of willfully abandoning. The question and answer also objectify the fact that while the prisoner has almost no voice, his confession is a halfway point in the disintegration of language, an audible objectification of the proximity of silence. The torturer and the regime have doubled their voice since the prisoner is now speaking their words. The interrogation is, therefore, crucial to a regime. Within the physical events of torture, the torturer has nothing, he has only an absence, the absence of pain. In order to experience his distance from the prisoner in terms of having / their physical difference is translated into a verbal difference, the absence of pain is a presence of world, the presence of pain is the absence of world. Across this set of inversions pain becomes power. The direct equation, the larger the prisoner's pain, the larger the torturer's world is mediated by the middle term, the prisoner's absence of world, the larger the prisoner's pain, the smaller the prisoner's world and therefore, by comparison, the larger the torturer's world. This set of inversions at once objectifies and falsifies the pain, objectifies one crucial aspect of pain in order to falsify all other aspects. The obliteration of the contents of consciousness, the elimination of world ground, which is a condition brought about by the pain and therefore one at once objectified, as it is in confession, should act as a sign of the pain, a call for help, an announcement of a radical occasion for attention and assistance, instead acts to discredit the claims of pain, to repel attention, to ensure that the pain will be unseen and unattended to. That not only the torturers but the world at large should tend to identify the confession as a betrayal makes very overt the fact that its absence of world earns the person in pain not compassion but contempt. This phenomenon in which the claims of pain are eclipsed by the very loss of world it has brought about is a crucial step in the overall process of perception that allows one person's physical pain to be understood as another person's power. When one human being recognizes the incontestable legitimacy of another human being's existence, he or she is locating the other's essential reality in one of two places, either in the complex fact of sentience or in the objects of sentience, in the fact of consciousness or in the objects of consciousness. In normal and benign contexts, the two occur together and imply one another. We respect the objects of sentience, the worldly forms of self-extension, precisely because they lead one into the fact of another's sentience. Gloucester's earldom, Winnie's handbag, Ibiatas Spain, Lear's feather are like luminous breadcrumbs leading home, traces in the external world of the overwhelming fact at the center. But the two can also become utterly split off from one another. When this happens, the very habit of seeing in the one the proximity of the other encourages the mistake of seeing in the absence of the one the absence of the other, seeing. In the loss of Gloucester's earldom, the loss of Gloucester's sentience, an act of perceptual brutality that is a private and silent form of putting out his eyes. A political situation is almost by definition one in which the two locations of selfhood are in a skewed relation to one another or have wholly split apart and have begun to work, or be worked, against one another. Torture is the most extreme instance of this situation, for one person gains more and more world ground not in spite of but because of the other's sentience. The overall equation it works to bring about, the larger the prisoner's pain, the larger the torturer's power can be restated. The more sentient the prisoner, the more numerous and extensive the torturer's objects of sentience. 22. The middle steps in the equation can also be rewritten in this language. To say the torturer inflicts pain in order to produce a confession is to say the torturer uses the prisoner's sentience to obliterate the objects of the prisoner's sentience, or the torturer uses the prisoner's aliveness to crush the things that he lives for. And, finally, the entire process is self-amplifying, for as the prisoner's sentience destroys his world, so now his absence of world, as described earlier, destroys the claims of sentience. The confession which displays the fact that he has nothing he lives for now obscures the fact that he is violently alive. Over and over, in each stage and step, the torturer's mime of expanding world ground depends on a demonstration of the prisoner's absence of world. The confession is one crucial demonstration of this absent world, but there are others. 2. The objectification of the prisoner's world dissolution. The disintegration of the contents of consciousness, the contraction and ultimate dissolution of the prisoner's world, acknowledged and objectified in confession, is also objectified in the physical objects the torturer uses as weapons, in the torturer's actions, and in the torturer's language. His weapons, his acts, and his words, all necessarily drawn from the world, all make visible the nature of his engagement with the world, though the scale differs in the three. The more physical each is, the smaller the world it represents. As physical objects, the weapons occupy the basic unit of shelter, the room, and so represent the world in its most contracted and distilled form. The room is barred, sealed, guarded, little of the larger world is allowed to enter, but in his physical acts and in his words, the torturer alludes to and allows to enter aspects of the world in a more expansive state, civilization in its more spacious form. In each of the three realms, as will be shown, the torturer dramatizes the disintegration of the world, the obliteration of consciousness that is happening within the prisoner himself. Brutal, savage, and barbaric, torture, even if unconsciously, self-consciously and explicitly announces its own nature as an undoing of civilization, acts out the uncreating of the created contents of consciousness. In normal contexts, the room, the simplest form of shelter, expresses the most benign potential of human life. It is, on the one hand, an enlargement of the body. It keeps warm and safe the individual it houses in the same way the body encloses and protects the individual within. Like the body, its walls put boundaries around the self, preventing undifferentiated contact with the world, yet in its windows and doors, crude versions of the senses, it enables the self to move out into the world and allows that world to enter. But while the room is a magnification of the body, it is simultaneously a miniaturization of the world, of civilization. Although its walls, for example, mimic the body's attempt to secure for the individual a stable internal space, stabilizing the temperature so that the body spends less time in this act, stabilizing the nearness of others so that the body can suspend its rigid and watchful postures, acting in these and other ways like the body SB that the body can act less like a wall. The walls are also, throughout all this, independent objects, objects which stand apart from and free of the body, objects which realize the human being's impulse to project himself out into a space beyond the boundaries of the body in acts of making, either physical or verbal, that once multiplied, collected, and shared are called civilization. There is nothing contradictory about the fact that the shelter is at once so graphic an image of the body and so emphatic an instance of civilization, only because it is the first can it be the second. It is only when the body is comfortable, when it has ceased to be an obsessive object of perception and concern, that consciousness develops other objects, that for any individual the external world, in part already existing and in part about to be formed, comes into being and begins to grow. Both in the details of its outer structure and in its furniture, from furnier meaning to further or to forward, to project oneself outward, the room accommodates and thereby eliminates from human attention a human body. The simple triad of floor, chair, and bed, or simpler still, floor, stool, and mat, makes spatially and therefore steadily visible the collection of postures and positions the body moves in and out of, objectifies the three locations within the body that most frequently hold the body's weight, objectifies its need continually to shift within itself the locus of its weight, objectifies, finally, its need to become wholly forgetful of its weight, to move weightlessly into a larger mindfulness. As the elemental room is multiplied into a house of rooms and the house into a city of houses, the body is carried forward into each successive intensification of civilization. In Western culture, whole rooms within a house attend to single facts about the body, the kitchen and eating, the bathroom and excreting, the bedroom and sleeping. So, too, entire cities become attentive to single facts about the body, as movement is visible in the car industry in Detroit, or eyesight and memory in the film and copying of Rochester. It is, though, back in the inward and enclosing space of the single room and its domestic content that the outward unfolding, so appropriately called the flowering, of civilization originates. One very beautiful honoring of this fact is the monument of the clothespin, a tiny domestic object transformed into something 40 feet high, upright, arching, and magnificent that Philadelphia has placed in the lap of its city hall. The shielding, holding gestures of the domestic are overtly present in the ordinary clothespin. One piece of wood is held to another piece of wood by a metal arm, and the three together now act as one to enable other things to be coupled to each other and to itself. In Oldenburg's clothespin, these successive acts of inanimate holding find their origin and destination in the inclusive sentience of the human hug, for the monument holds within itself the gracious and self-confident embrace of two lovers. The scale of this clothespin, its complete ease in the presence of City Hall, its recognition that the enduring and monumental reside in the daily, its discovery of the broad pleasures of magnanimous intelligence in the narrow reflexes of punning wit, its identification of pressing with expressing and holding in with reaching out, all these are translations of and tributes to the central, overwhelming characteristic of the domestic, that its protective, narrowing act is the location of the human being's most expansive potential. In torture, the world is reduced to a single room or set of rooms. Called guest rooms in Greece 23 and safe houses in the Philippines 24, the torture rooms are often given names that acknowledge and call attention to the generous, civilizing impulse normally present in the human shelter. They call attention to this impulse only as prelude to announcing its annihilation. The torture room is not just the setting in which the torture occurs, it is not just the space that happens to house the various instruments used for beating and burning and producing electric shock. It is itself literally converted into another weapon, into an agent of pain. All aspects of the basic structure, walls, ceiling, windows, doors undergo this conversion. Basques tortured by the Spanish describe El Cerrojo, the rapid and repeated bolting and unbolting of the door in order to keep them at all times in immediate anticipation of further torture, as one of the most terrifying and damaging acts. 25 found among Pide's paraphernalia in Portugal were manuscripts of gibberish which, according to the men and women brutalized there, were read at the doors of prisoners deprived of sleep for days. 26 Solzhenitsyn describes how in Russia guards were trained to slam the door in as jarring a way as possible or to close it in equally unnerving silence. 27 Former prisoners in the Philippines report having had their heads repeatedly banged into the wall. 28 Israeli soldiers held in Syria describe being suspended from the ceiling in attire that was swung as they were beaten, or having one's genitals tied by a string to a door handle and having the string beaten. 29 According to the testimony of Greeks tortured under the colonel's regime, the act of looking out a window was made the occasion for beatings. Prisoners were taken to the window and threatened that they would be defenestrated. They were made to stand against the wall and recite obscenities or push against the wall while repeatedly reciting the line, "Make way, wall, that I may pass." They were subjected to the Greek equivalent of El Cerrojo. The door was left open to make audible conversations threatening to the prisoner, his friends, or family. 30 Just as all aspects of the concrete structure are inevitably assimilated into the process of torture, so too the contents of the room, its furnishings, are converted into weapons. The most common instance of this is the bathtub that figures prominently in the reports from numerous countries, but it is only one among many. Men and women tortured during the period of martial law in the Philippines, for example, described being tied or handcuffed in a constricted position for hours, days, and in some cases months to a chair, to a cot, to a filing cabinet, to a bed. 31 They describe being beaten with family-sized soft drink bottles or having a hand crushed with a chair, of having their heads repeatedly banged on the edges of a refrigerator door or repeatedly pounded against the edges of a filing cabinet. 32 The room, both in its structure and its content, is converted into a weapon, deconverted, undone. Made to participate in the annihilation of the prisoners, made to demonstrate that everything is a weapon, the objects themselves, and with them the fact of civilization, are annihilated. There is no wall, no window, no door, no bathtub, no refrigerator, no chair, no bed. Beside the overwhelming fact that a human being is being severely hurt, the exact nature of the weapon or the miming of the deconstruction of civilization is at most secondary. But it is also crucial to see that the two are here forced into being expressions and amplifications of one another. The objectifying of the objects, the unmaking of the made, is a process externalizing the way in which the person's pain causes his world to disintegrate, and, at the same time, the disintegration of the world is here, in the most literal way possible, made painful, made the direct cause of the pain. That is, in the conversion of a refrigerator into a bludgeon, the refrigerator disappears, its disappearance objectifies the disappearance of the world, sky, country, bench, experienced by a person in great pain, and it is the very fact of its disappearance, its transition from a refrigerator into a bludgeon, that inflicts the pain. The domestic act of protecting becomes an act of hurting, and in hurting, the object becomes what it is not, an expression of individual contraction, of the retreat into the most self-absorbed and self-experiencing of human feelings, when it is the very essence of these objects to express the most expansive potential of the human being, his ability to project himself out of his private, isolating needs into a concrete, objectified, and therefore shareable world. The appearance of these common domestic objects in torture reports of the 1970s is no more gratuitous and accidental than the fact that so much of our awareness of Germany in the 1940s is attached to the words ovens, showers, lampshades, and soap. The prisoner's physical world is limited to the room and its contents. No other concrete embodiments of civilization pass through the doors. But two of civilization's institutions, though not physically present, are constantly alluded to in the action of torture, and so hover behind and arch over the physical reality of the sealed room. Like the domestic objects, these institutions are unmade by being made weapons. The first is, of course, the trial. In its basic outlines, torture is the inversion of the trial, a reversal of cause and effect. While the one studies evidence that may lead to punishment, the other uses punishment to generate the evidence. The slogans of the South Vietnamese torturers announce what is there and elsewhere always visible in the process itself. If they are not guilty, beat them until they are. If you are not a Viet Cong, we will beat you until you admit you are, and if you admit you are, we will beat you until you no longer dare to be one. 33 The second institution ubiquitously present by inversion is medicine. Solzhenitsyn's The Gulag Archipelago describes the process by which in Russia the doctor becomes the torturer's * right-hand man. 34 In Greece, a man referred to as Dr. Kofas was a major focus throughout the trial of the torturers who had served the colonel's regime. 35 Reports of torture from pre-1ers in the Philippines include references to * unwanted dental treatment. 36 In Chile, absurdly negligent medical treatment is said by many to have worsened the patient's condition, and there are reports of prisoners being overdosed with lethal drugs. 37 In Portugal, doctors study photographs of maimed prisoners as well as the prisoners themselves in order to further the design of the torture procedure. 38 In Brazil, there were forms of torture called the mad dentist and the operating table. 39 Syrian prisoners of Israel claim to have undergone possibly unnecessary amputations, to have had wounds cleaned with petrol, and to have had absurdly large amounts of blood taken. 40 In Uruguay, doctors assisted in the administration of drugs causing hallucinations and acute sensations of pain and asphyxiation. Those who refused to assist the torturers disappeared at such a rate that Uruguay's medical and healthcare programs entered a state of crisis. 41 It is unnecessary to catalog the instances endlessly. Whether medicine merely provides the equipment. 42 Or the name for a form of torture, whether the doctor ever was a doctor or has only assumed a role. 43 Whether he designs the form of torture used, inflicts the brutality himself, assists the process by healing the person so he can be again tortured, or legitimizes the process by the masquerade of aid. The institution of medicine, like that of justice, is deconstructed, unmade by being made at once an actual agent of the pain and a demonstration of the effects of pain on human consciousness. While other institutions are alluded to in the process of torture, their appearance is sporadic and usually the result of the accidental location of the torture rooms or headquarters, the sports stadium in Chile, the police station in Paraguay, the traffic control office in Greece, and, in an earlier decade, the sweets factory in Algeria. 44 But it is in the nature of torture that the two ubiquitously present should be medicine and law, health, and justice, for they are the institutional elaborations of body and state. These two were also the institutions most consistently inverted in the concentration camps, though they were slightly differently defined in accordance with Germany's position as a modern, industrialized mass society, the body occurring not in medicine but in its variant, the scientific laboratory, the state occurring not in the process of law, the trial, but in the process of production, the factory. As the torturer uses the immediate physical setting in a direct deconstruction of the smallest unit of civilization, and as his actions allude to and subvert larger units of civilization, two of its primary institutional forms, so his words reach out, body forth, and destroy more distant and more numerous manifestations of civilization. Amid his insistent questions and exclamations, his jeers, gibberish, obscenities, his incomprehensible laughter, his monosyllables, his grunts, for just as a person in pain reverts to sounds prior to language, the cries and screams of human hurt, so the person inflicting pain reverts to a pre-language, uncaring noises remembered in the accounts given by former political prisoners and sometimes included in fictional accounts of brutality, such as Zola's portrait of Bijard in Alice Somewhere. There are words, random words, names for torture, names for the prisoner's body, and this idiom continually moves out to the realm of the man-made, the world of technology and artifice. The twofold denial of the human, both the particular human being her and the collective human present in the products of civilization, is more easily apprehended if one first recalls the overwhelming experience to which any one of these names is being attached. In the center of the room there was an ordinary bathtub, rather large. From a hole in the wall hung a plastic pipe from which water was flowing to fill the bath. On the opposite wall stood out two iron rings a little smaller than a riding stirrup. On the left side there was a large, red-colored light like a semaphore. On the other side a cross had been scratched into the wall and painted, about 30 by 15 centimeters, more or less. The man in charge made me look at the cross. Running his index finger along the groove, he said to me, "This is where a tailor died last December, and you run the same risk if you don't tell us what you know." As I did not reply to them, they made me look at the red-colored light, which they lit up at once. Within 5 minutes I was dazzled. I could see only a large round menacing cloud about 2 meters big before my eyes, with semi-darkness round about. They made me sit down on the edge of the trough at its highest part, having first tied my feet with ropes and my hands behind my back. I was stripped of my clothes. Suddenly they grabbed me by the shoulders and pushed me to the bottom of the trough. I held my breath a while, making desperate efforts to get my head out of the water and take in some air. I managed to free my head, but they submerged me again, and when my efforts to get out became violent, the heaviest members of the group trampled on the top part of my body. I could no longer bear the lack of air and began to swallow water through my mouth, nose, and ears. My ears started to hum as the water made its way in. They seemed to be blowing up like a balloon. Then came a sharp whistling, very loud at first, which has not yet completely gone, and which I hear when there is complete silence. The more I swallowed water, the more my struggles to breathe also increased, and they all pressed me down to the bottom of the trough. My head, chest, and hands, I must have swallowed 8 to 10 liters of water. When they took me out and laid me on the ground, one of them trod heavily on my stomach. Water poured out from my mouth and nose, spurting like a jet from a hose. After a second session of immersion having first drained my stomach, they made me sit on a chair. As I was now weak from exhaustion, they did not use the ring in the wall, but whipped me with a plaited rope. 45. To attach any name, any word to the willful infliction of this bodily agony is to make language and civilization participate in their own destruction. The specific names chosen merely make this subversion more overt. The form of torture described here, used in the 1970s in the Philippines, Vietnam, Uruguay, Brazil, and Paraguay, is in the torturer's idiom almost everywhere referred to as the submarine when water or soapy water or dirty water is used, is in some places called the Portuguese submarine when the water is electrified, and is usually called the dry submarine if the person is held in a plastic bag or immersed in feces. The nomenclature for torture is typically drawn from 3 spheres of civilization. First, as in the above instance, the prolonged, acute distress of the body is in its contortions claimed to be mimetic of a particular invention or technological feat. The person's pain will be called the telephone in Brazil, the plane ride in Vietnam, the Motorola in Greece, and the San Juanica Bridge in the Philippines. 46. The second sphere is the realm of cultural events, ceremonies, and games. There is the dance in Argentina, the birthday party in the Philippines, and hors d'oeuvres, tea party, and tea party with toast in Greece. 47. Though the primary act of eating or moving, along with all other primary acts of the body, will at some point be brought into the torture process, it is naturally not the acts of eating or moving themselves but the self-consciously civilized elaborations of these acts, the dinner party or the dance, that the torturer's words reach out for. The third realm is nature or nature civilized. It enters less frequently than the first two and, when it does, is usually limited to that part of nature that is dainty, diminutive, or mythologized, easily assimilated into the human framework. The tiger cages of Vietnam are exceptional. More typical are the little hare of Greece, the parrot's perch of Brazil and Uruguay, and the dragon's chair of Brazil. 48. In all these cases the designation of an intensely painful form of bodily contortion with a word usually reserved for an instance of civilization produces a circle of negation. There is no human being in excruciating pain. That's only a telephone. There is no telephone. That is merely a means of destroying a human being who is not a human being, who is only a telephone, who is not a telephone but merely a means of destroying a telephone. The double negation of a human being and a symptom of civilization combine to bring about a third area of negation, the negation of the torturer's recognition of what is happening, a negation that will in turn allow the first two to continue. The torturer's idiom not only indicates but helps bring about the process of perception in which all human reality is made, no matter how screamingly present, invisible, inaudible. Through the torturer's language, his actions, and the physical setting, the world is brought to the prisoner in 3 rings. The random technological and cultural embodiments of civilization overarch the 2 primary social institutions of medicine and law, which in turn overarch the basic unit of shelter, the room. Just as the prisoner's confession makes visible the contraction and closing in of its universe, so the torturer reenacts this world collapse. Civilization is brought to the prisoner and in his presence annihilated in the very process by which it is being made to annihilate him. Civilization itself in its language and its literature records the path that torture in its unconscious miming of the deconstruction of civilization follows in reverse. The protective, healing, expansive acts implicit in host and hostile and hospital all converge back in hosps, which in turn moves back to the root hose meaning house, shelter, or refuge. But once back at hose, its generosity can be undone by an alternative movement forward into hostess, the source of hostility and hostage and host not the host that willfully abandons the ground of his power in acts of reciprocity and equality but the host deprived of all ground, the host of the Eucharist, the sacrificial victim. Even fictional representations of torture like Kafka's in the Penal Colony, where the lethal apparatus is an enlarged and elaborate sewing machine, record the fact that the unmaking of civilization inevitably requires a return to and mutilation of the domestic, the ground of all making. This world unmaking, this uncreating of the created world, which is an external objectification of the psychic experience of the person in pain, becomes itself the cause of the pain. Although the world is, as in Sartre's short story, reduced to the crushingly blank and uniform wall, it is not, as in Sartre's story, merely the harsh undifferentiated surface against which the execution occurs. It is itself the executioner's weapon, it is the world, the wall, that executes. Whatever its political naivete or its melodramatic intentions, Poe's The Pit and the Pendulum discovers in its final moments the single distilled form of torture that in many ways represents all forms of torture, the walls collapsing in on the human center to crush it alive. 3. The transformation of body into voice. The appropriation of the world into the torturer's arsenal of weapon is a crucial step in the overall process of torture for, as was suggested at the opening of this chapter, it is by the obsessive mediation of agency that the prisoner's pain will be perverted into the fraudulent assertion of power. 49 That the objectified pain is denied as pain and read as power. At first, the weapon or agent seems to be only the torturers and whatever piece of apparatus serves as their primary tool, but now the environment too has joined them, been compelled to participate in and amplify their swelling sense of causality. Absolutely everything but the prisoner himself stands present as a weapon, and ultimately he, too, is assimilated into the perceptual strategies of agency. The process by which this final assimilation takes place will be visible in a return to and review of the relation between the pain and the interrogation, the connections between physical and verbal acts. For the translation of pain into power is ultimately a transformation of body into voice, a transformation arising in part out of the dissonance of the two, in part out of the consonance of the two. A large part of the mime of power emerges out of the opposition of body and voice. The torturer experiences his own body and voice as opposites, the prisoner experiences his own body and voice as opposites, the prisoner's experience of the two is an inversion of the torturer's. Hence there are 4 sets of oppositions. The pain is hugely present to the prisoner and absent to the torturer. The question is, within the political fiction, hugely significant to the torturer and insignificant to the prisoner. For the prisoner, the body and its pain are overwhelmingly present and voice, world, and self are absent. For the torturer, voice, world, and self are overwhelmingly present and the body and pain are absent. These multiple sets of oppositions at every moment announce and magnify the distance between torturer and prisoner and thereby dramatize the former's power, for power is in its fraudulent as in its legitimate forms always based on distance from the body. But the very consistency of these oppositions between body and voice means that the two also mirror one another. Assigned identical positions, they reflect and amplify one another. Just as the pain is a physical measure of the colossal discrepancy between the person tortured and the torturer, for whatever their spatial proximity, there are no two experiences farther apart than suffering and inflicting pain, so the interrogation is the verbal objectification of that colossal discrepancy. In his desperate insistence that his questions be answered, the torturer luxuriates in the privilege or absurdity of having a world that the other has ceased to have. Nowhere does language come so close to being the concrete agent of physical pain as here, where it not only occurs in such close proximity to the raising of the rod or the turning on of the electricity, but also parallels and thereby doubles the display of distance. Just as the words of the one have become a weapon, so the words of the other are an expression of pain, in many cases telling the torturer nothing except how badly the prisoner hurts. The question, whatever its content, is an act of wounding. The answer, whatever its content, is a scream. This identification of the physical and verbal acts is consciously or unconsciously acknowledged in the language of the torturers themselves. The leading generals in charge of torture under the colonel's regime in Greece repeatedly spoke to their prisoners in images dramatizing the connection between two dreaded forms of exposure, open wounds, and confession. Paisiges punched me in the chest one day and said, "Here, you're going to tell all. You will open out like a rose." 50 of the many forms of brutality used under this regime, the most persistent, other than phalange, was the delivery of repeated blows to the prisoner's sternum, often causing him to vomit blood. This type of body damage provided the torturers with their idiom for confession: "Here you'll spew it all up. You are Mitsuki, the taxi driver whom we've been hunting for. Now you're in our hands. We know everything. This is ESA. You'll vomit blood and tell us yourself." 51. There is a second equally crucial and equally cruel bond between physical pain and interrogation that further explains their inevitable appearance together. Just as the interrogation, like the pain, is a way of wounding, so the pain, like the interrogation, is a vehicle of self-betrayal. Torture systematically prevents the prisoner from being the agent of anything and simultaneously pretends that he is the agent of some things, despite the fact that in reality he has been deprived of all control over, and therefore all responsibility for, his world, his words, and his body. He is to understand his confession as it will be understood by others, as an act of self-betrayal. In forcing him to confess or, as often happens, to sign an unread confession, the torturers are producing a mime in which the one annihilated shifts to being the agent of his own annihilation. But this mime, though itself a lie, mimes something real and already present in the physical pain. It is a visible counterpart to an invisible but intensely felt aspect of pain. Regardless of the setting in which he suffers, home, hospital, or torture room, and regardless of the cause of his suffering, disease, burns, torture, or malfunctioning of the pain network itself, the person in great pain experiences his own body as the agent of his agony. The ceaseless, self-announcing signal of the body in pain, at once so empty and undifferentiated and so full of blaring adversity, contains not only the feeling my body hurts but the feeling my body hurts me. This part of the pain, like almost all others, is usually invisible to anyone outside the boundaries of the sufferer's body, though it sometimes becomes visible when a young child or an animal in the first moments of acute distress takes maddening flight, fleeing from its own body as though it were a part of the environment that could be left behind. If self-hatred, self-alienation, and self-betrayal, as well as the hatred of, alienation from, and betrayal of all that is contained in the self, friends, family, ideas, ideology, were translated out of the psychological realm where it has content and is accessible to language into the unspeakable and contentless realm of physical sensation, it would be intense pain. This unseen sense of self-betrayal in pain, objectified in forced confession, is also objectified in forced exercises that make the prisoner's body an active agent, an actual cause of his pain. He may be put in a contorted posture in a cramped space for months or for years as happened in Vietnam. He may be made to walk ceaselessly on bended knees as in Spain, squat until he collapses, and carry a heavy stone while being beaten as in the Philippines. He may be made to stand upright in his cell each day for 11 hours as in Argentina. He may be made to throw his head back as far as possible and, as in Greece where it was called making knots, repeatedly swallow his own saliva. 52 Part of his sense of his body as agent comes at the moment when his failure to sustain the prescribed posture or exercise brings from the torturer another form of punishment. But, for the prisoner and those present, the most emphatic and direct exhibition of self-agency comes from the exercise itself. Standing rigidly for 11 hours can produce as violent muscle and spine pain as can injury from elaborate equipment and apparatus, though any of us outside the situation, used to adjusting our body positions every few moments before even mild discomfort is felt, may not immediately recognize this. W.K. Livingston, a leading researcher of the physiology of pain, describes his own incomprehension when a colleague who suffered nauseating pain each day for years as a result of amputation, attributed much of his agony to a feeling of tenseness. I once asked him why the sense of tenseness in the hand was so frequently emphasized among his complaints. He asked me to clench my fingers over my thumb, flex my wrist, and raise the arm into a hammer-lock position and hold it there. He kept me in this position as long as I could stand it. At the end of 5 minutes I was perspiring freely, my hand and arm felt unbearably cramped, and I quit. But you can take your hand down, he said. Point 53. Only when a person throws his head back and swallows 3 times does he begin to apprehend what is involved in 103 or 303 swallows, what atrocities one's own body, muscle, and bone structure can inflict on oneself. The political prisoner is, of course, reminded of this at every moment. Each source of strength and delight, each means of moving out into the world or moving the world into oneself, becomes a means of turning the body back in on itself, forcing the body to feed on the body. The eyes are only access points for scorching light, the ears for brutal noises, eating. The act at once so incredible and so simple in which the world is literally taken into the body, is replaced by rituals of starvation involving either no food or food that nauseates, taste and smell, too. Whole sensory modes that have emerged to watch over the entry of the world into the body, are systematically abused with burns and cuts to the inside of nose and mouth, and with bug-infested or putrefying substances. Normal needs like excretion and special wants like sexuality are made ongoing sources of outrage and repulsion. Even the most small and benign of bodily acts becomes a form of agency. In the first circle, Solzhenitsyn describes how prisoners, while sleeping, were forced to keep their hands outside the blanket, and he writes, it was a diabolical rule. It is a natural, deep-rooted, unnoticed human habit to hide one's hands while asleep, to hold them against one's body. 54. The prisoner's body in its physical strengths, in its sensory powers, in its needs and wants, in its ways of self-delight, and finally even, as here, in its small and moving gestures of friendship toward itself is, like the prisoner's voice, made a weapon against him, made to betray him on behalf of the enemy, made to be the enemy. But the relation between body and voice that for the prisoner begins in opposition. The pain is so real that the question is unreal, insignificant, and that goes on to become an identification. The question, like the pain, is a way of wounding. The pain, like the question, is a vehicle of self-betrayal, ultimately ends in opposition once more. For what the process of torture does is to split a human being into two, to make emphatic the ever-present but, except in the extremity of sickness and death, only latent distinction between the self and the body. Between a me and my body. The self or me, which is experienced on the one hand as more private, more essentially at the center, and on the other hand as participating across the bridge of the body in the world, is embodied in the voice, in language. The goal of the torturer is to make the one, the body, emphatically and crushingly present by destroying it, and to make the other, the voice, absent by destroying it. It is in part this combination that makes torture, like any experience of great physical pain, mimetic of death, for in death the body is emphatically present while that more elusive part represented by the voice is so alarmingly absent that heavens are created to explain its whereabouts. Through his ability to project words and sounds out into his environment, a human being inhabits, humanizes, and makes his own space much larger than that occupied by his body alone. This space asterisk always contracted under repressive regimes, is in torture almost wholly eliminated. Fit it in, get it out of him. Refers not just to a piece of information but to the capacity for speech itself. The written or tape-recorded confession that can be carried away on a piece of paper or on a tape is only the most concrete exhibition of the torturer's attempt to induce sounds so that they can then be broken off from their speaker so that they can then be taken off and made the property of the regime. The torturer tries to make his own not only the words of the prisoner's confession but all his words and sounds. One form of stress imposed on Portuguese prisoners was making them speak in a constant loud volume to other prisoners. Point 55. In Greece, a similar rule was extended to nonverbal forms of sound. The officer was not satisfied with my answer and hit me again. Here the guard ordered me to walk so that my steps would be heard. He said I was to walk on the double 56. He will, while being heard, be made to speak, to sing, and, of course, to scream, and even those screams, the sounds anterior to language that a human being reverts to when overwhelmed by pain, will in turn be broken off and made the property of the torturers in one of two ways. They will, first of all, be used as the occasion for, be made the agent of, another act of punishment. As the torturer displays his control of the other's voice by first inducing screams, he now displays that same control by stopping them. A pillow or a pistol or an iron ball or a soiled rag or a paper packet of excrement is shoved into the person's mouth, or a loud motor is placed next to his head, or electricity is used to contract his jaws. Point 57. Secondly, in many countries these screams are, like the words of the confession, tape-recorded and then played where they can be heard by fellow prisoners, close friends, and relatives. Point 58. Again and again the descriptions given by those who have been imprisoned and tortured are full of cries, phrases, fragments of speech whose source cannot be identified. Someone was sobbing, someone was screaming, someone called out, "Stop it, you'll kill him." Who was it? Is he responding to my being hurt? Can he see me? Or is it his own hurt? Are they too being brutalized? Do those screams come from someone now being tortured? Are they the tape recording of someone previously tortured? Is it my husband's voice? My child's? Are these so compelling sounds the sounds of real human hurt, or are they sounds made up to mock and torment me? In this closed world where conversation is displaced by interrogation, where human speech is broken off in confession and disintegrates into human cries, where even those cries can be broken off to become one more weapon against the person himself or against a friend, in this world of broken and severed voices, it is not surprising that the most powerful and healing moment is often that in which a human voice, though still severed, floating free, somehow reaches the person whose sole reality had become his own unthinkable isolation, his deep corporeal engulfment. The prisoner who, alone in long solitary confinement and repeatedly tortured, found within a loaf of bread a matchbox containing a small piece of paper that had written on it the single, whispered word "Corr Agio." Take courage. 59. The Uruguayan man arranging for some tangible signal that his words had reached their destination. My darling, if you receive this letter, put a half a bar of boa soap in the next parcel. 60. The imprisoned Chilean women who on Christmas Eve sang with all their might to their men in a separate camp the song they had written, Take Heart asterisk Jose, my love, and who, through the abuse of shouts of guards ordering silence, heard faintly on the wind the answering song of the men. 61. These acts and their multiplication in the extensive and ongoing attempts of Amnesty International to restore to each person tortured his or her voice, to use language to let pain give an accurate account of itself, to present regimes that torture with a deluge of letters and telegrams, a deluge of voices speaking on behalf of, voices speaking in the voice of, the person silenced. These acts that return to the prisoner his most elemental political ground as well as his psychic content and density are finally almost physiological in their power of alteration. As torture consists of acts that magnify the way in which pain destroys a person's world, self, and voice, so these other acts that restore the voice become not only a denunciation of the pain but almost a diminution of the pain, a partial reversal of the process of torture itself. An act of human contact and concern, whether occurring here or in private contexts of sympathy, provides the hurt person with worldly self-extension, in acknowledging and expressing another person's pain, or in articulating one of his non-bodily concerns while he is unable to. One human being who is well and free willingly turns himself into an image of the other's psychic or sentient claims, an image existing in the space outside the sufferer's body, projected out into the world and held there, intact by that person's powers until the sufferer himself regains his own powers of self-extension. By holding that world in place, or by giving the pain a place in the world, sympathy lessens the power of sickness and pain. Counteracts the force with which a person in great pain or sickness can be swallowed alive by the body. To acknowledge the radical subjectivity of pain is to acknowledge the simple and absolute incompatibility of pain and the world. The survival of each depends on its separation from the other. To bring them together, to bring pain into the world by objectifying it in language, is to destroy one of them, either, as in the case of Amnesty International and parallel efforts in other areas, the pain is objectified, articulated, brought into the world in such a way that the pain itself is diminished and destroyed, or alternatively, as in torture and parallel forms of sadism, the pain is at once objectified and falsified, articulated but made to refer to something else and in the process, the world, or some dramatized surrogate of the world, is destroyed. As the opening of this chapter asserted and as the previous description has tried to show, torture is a form of savagery and stupidity, words invoked here as literal designations rather than as dismissive labels, that has a structure. This structure may be in part premeditated, seems for the most part unconscious, and is in either case based on the nature of pain, the nature of power, the interaction between the two, and the interaction between the ultimate source of each, the body, the locus of pain, and the voice, the locus of power. It involves the invariable and simultaneous occurrence of three phenomena which, for the sake of description and summary, can be isolated into three separate and sequential steps. For three simultaneous phenomena in the structure of torture. 1. The infliction of pain. 2. The objectification of the subjective attributes of pain. 3. The translation of the objectified attributes of pain into the insignia of power. The first of the three steps is the infliction of great physical pain on a human being. Although this is the most heinous part of the process, it alone would never accomplish the torturer's goal. One aspect of great pain as acknowledged by those who have suffered it in diverse political and private contexts, and as asserted by those who have studied it from the perspective of psychology, philosophy, and physiology, and, finally, as becomes obvious to common sense alone, is that it is to the individual experiencing it overwhelmingly present, more emphatically real than any other human experience, and yet is almost invisible to anyone else, unfelt, and unknown. Even prolonged, agonized human screams, which press on the hearer's consciousness in something of the same way pain presses on the consciousness of the person heard, convey only a limited dimension of the sufferer's experience. It may be for this reason that images of the human scream recur fairly often in the visual arts, which for the most part avoid depictions of auditory experience. The very failure to convey the sound makes these representations arresting and accurate. The open mouth with no sound reaching anyone in the sketches, paintings, or film stills of Grunewald, Stanzian, Munch, Bacon, Bergman, or Eisenstein, a human being so utterly consumed in the act of making a sound that cannot be heard, coincides with the way in which pain engulfs the one in pain but remains unsensed by anyone else. For the torturer, it is not enough that the prisoner experience pain. Its reality, although already incontestable to the sufferer, must be made equally incontestable to those outside the sufferer. Pain is therefore made visible in the multiple and elaborate processes that involve in producing it. Then, the second step of torture, the subjective characteristics of pain are objectified. Although the prisoner's internal experience may be close to or identical with that of a person suffering severe pain from burns or a stroke or cancer or phantom limb, it is, unlike this other person's, simultaneously being externalized. The following attributes belong equally to the felt experience of patient and prisoner, although it is only in the second context, or in some other area of objectification, that they become graspable from the outside. The first, the most essential, aspect of pain is its sheer aversiveness. While other sensations have content that may be positive, neutral, or negative, the very content of pain is itself negation. If to the person in pain it does not feel averse, and if it does not in turn elicit in that person aversive feelings toward it, it is not in either philosophical discussions or psychological definitions of it called pain. 62 Pain is a pure physical experience of negation, an immediate sensory rendering of against, of something being against one, and of something one must be against. Even though it occurs within oneself, it is at once identified as not oneself, not me, as something so alien that it must right now be gotten rid of. This internal physical experience is in torture accompanied by its external political equivalent, the presence in the space outside the body of a self-proclaimed enemy, someone who in becoming the enemy becomes the human embodiment of aversiveness. He ceases to have any psychological characteristics or content other than that he is, like physical pain, not me, against me, although there are many averse political contexts in occupied town or a prison, for example where the againstness exists in an implicit and silent state of readiness, exists not now but only as an always close of the future. It is the very nature of torture to in each present moment identify, announce, act out in brutality, accusation, and challenge the state of its own otherness, the state of being against, the fact of being the enemy. A second and third aspect of pain, closely related to the first, are the double experience of agency. While pain is in part a profound sensory rendering of against, it is also a rendering of the something that is against, as something at once internal and external. Even when there is an actual weapon present, the sufferer may be dominated by a sense of internal agency. It has often been observed that when a knife or a nail or pin enters the body, one feels not the knife, nail or pin but one's own body hurting one. Conversely, in the utter absence of any actual external cause, there often arises a vivid sense of external agency, a sense apparent in our elementary, everyday vocabulary for pain, knife-like pains, stabbing, boring, searing pains. In physical pain, then, suicide and murder converge, for one feels acted upon, annihilated, by inside and outside alike. The sense of self-agency, visible in many dimensions of torture, is primarily dramatized there in the ritualized self-betrayal of confession and forced exercise. The sense of external agency is objectified in the systematic assimilation of shelter and civilization into the torturer's collection of weapons. But inside and outside and the two forms of agency ultimately give way to and merge with one another. Confession and exercises are a form of external as well as internal agency, since one's own body and voice now no longer belong to oneself, and the conversion of the physical and cultural setting into torture instruments is internal as well as external, since it acts as an image of the impact of pain on human consciousness. This dissolution of the boundary between inside and outside gives rise to a fourth aspect of the felt experience of physical pain, an almost obscene conflation of private and public. It brings with it all the solitude of absolute privacy with none of its safety, all the self-exposure of the utterly public with none of its possibility for camaraderie or shared experience. Artistic objectifications of pain often concentrate on this combination of isolation and exposure. Ingmar Bergman's films repeatedly couple physical pain with intense moments of humiliation. In the opening sequence of Sawdust and Tinsel, for example, a cuckolded clown, alone amid the jeers of watching soldiers, carries the naked and impossibly heavy body of his faithless, cared-for wife up a steep hill of rocks that slice his bare feet. The terrain of Sophocles' Philoctetes sets the background against which we watch and hear the agonized writhing of the wounded hero, writhing which so repelled his shipmates that they long ago abandoned him. Here is a small island of jagged rocks at once utterly cut off from homeland and humanity and utterly open to the elements. The solitary figure in the typical canvas of Francis Bacon is made emphatically alone by his position on a dais, by an arbitrary geometric box inserted over him, and by his naked presence against a uniform, and in its uniformity, almost absolute, orange-red background. Yet while he is intensely separate from the viewer, a separation Bacon wanted to heighten further by having the canvases covered with glass, he is simultaneously mercilessly exposed to us, not merely because he is undressed, unshielded by any material or clothing, but because his melting body is turned inside out, revealing the most inward and secret parts of him. This combination, not usually as in these artistic objectifications visible to an outsider but always present in the felt experience of pound hand, is part of the ongoing external action and activity of torture, for the prisoner is forced to attend to the most intimate and interior facts of his body, pain, hunger, nausea, sexuality, excretion, at a time when there is no benign privacy, for he is under continual surveillance, and there is no benign public, for there is no human contact, but instead only an ugly inverting of the two. A fifth dimension of physical pain is its ability to destroy language, the power of verbal objectification, a major source of our self-extension, a vehicle through which the pain could be lifted out into the world and eliminated. Before destroying language, it first monopolizes language, becomes its only subject, complaint, in many ways the non-political equivalent of confession, becomes the exclusive mode of speech. Eventually the pain so deepens that the coherence of complaint is displaced by the sounds anterior to learned language. The tendency of pain not simply to resist expression but to destroy the capacity for speech is in torture reenacted in overt, exaggerated form. Even where the torturers do not permanently eliminate the voice through mutilation or murder, they mime the work of pain by temporarily breaking off the voice, making it their own, making it speak their words, making it cry out when they want it to cry, be silent when they wanted silence, turning it on and off, using its sound to abuse the one whose voice it is as well as other prisoners. The derisive connotations of betrayal surrounding confession also reveal in heightened form the process by which in non-political contexts a person's complaint-filled, deteriorating, or absent language obscures and discredits his needs at the very moment when they are most acute. Even in 1976 and 1977 when the American news media for the first time began to devote space and sympathetic attention to the problems of physical pain, it was not unusual to see sometimes in local papers articles with headlines such as "A pain is a pain if you complain" and "Chronic pain can make you one." A sixth element of physical pain, one that overlaps but is not quite coterminous with the previous element, is its obliteration of the contents of consciousness. Pain annihilates not only the objects of complex thought and emotion but also the objects of the most elemental acts of perception. It may begin by destroying some intricate and demanding allegiance, but it may end, as is implied in the expression blinding pain, by destroying one's ability simply to see. In torture, this world dissolution, acknowledged in confession, is mimed in the conversion into weapons and resulting cancellation of all parts of the room as well as all parts of the larger world that can be bodied forth in the torturer's action and speech. A seventh aspect of pain, built on the first six, is its totality. Pain begins by being not oneself and ends by having eliminated all that is not itself. At first occurring only as an appalling but limited internal fact, it eventually occupies the entire body and spills out into the realm beyond the body, takes over all that is inside and outside, makes the two obscenely indistinguishable, and systematically destroys anything like language or world extension that is alien to itself and threatening to its claims. Terrifying for its narrowness, it nevertheless exhausts and displaces all else until it seems to become the single broad and omnipresent fact of existence. From no matter what perspective pain is approached, its totality is again and again faced. Even neurological and physiological descriptions repeatedly acknowledge the breadth of its presence. Its mastery of the body, for example, is suggested by the failure of many surgical attempts to remove pain pathways because the body quickly, effortlessly, and endlessly generates new pathways. 64 of its location in the brain, Meltsack writes. It is traditionally assumed that pain sensation and response are subserved by a pain center in the brain. The concept of a pain center, however, is totally inadequate to account for the complexity of pain. Indeed, the concept is pure fiction, unless virtually the whole brain is considered to be the pain center, because the thalamus, hypothalamus, brainstem reticular formation, limbic system, parietal cortex, and frontal cortex are all implicated in pain perception. Other brain areas are obviously involved in the emotional and motor features of pain. 65. This same totality is equally descriptive of felt experience. Although other sensations sometimes have the power to diminish pain by distracting the person's attention, in prolonged and acute pain the body often begins to interpret all sensations as pain. S. W. Mitchell, a Civil War surgeon, a minor though prolific novelist, and a major figure in medical research and observation of wounds and wound pain, writes. Perhaps few persons who are not physicians can realize the influence which long-continued and unendurable pain may have upon both body and mind. The older books are full of cases in which, after lancet wounds, the most terrible pain and local spasms resulted. When these had lasted for days or weeks, the whole surface became hyperesthetic, and the senses grew to be only avenues for fresh and increasing tortures, until every vibration, every change of light, and even the effort to re-brought on new agony. 66. Torture aspires to the totality of pain. Antonin Artaud once described the way in which a pain as it intensifies and deepens, multiplies its resources and means of access at every level of the sensibility. 67. So the torturers, like pain itself, continually multiply their resources and means of access until the room and everything in it becomes a giant externalized map of the prisoner's feelings, almost as obsessively narrow and repetitive as the pain on which it models itself. Torture can be more easily seen because it has dimension and depth, a space that can be walked around in though not walked out of. Here there is nothing audible or visible, there is nothing that can be touched, or tasted, or smelled that is not the palpable manifestation of the prisoner's pain. The eighth and, for now, final element carries us back to where we were immediately before starting this enumeration of objectified elements of pain, namely, that one of its most frightening aspects is its resistance to objectification. Though indisputably real to the sufferer, it is, unless accompanied by visible body damage or a disease label, unreal to others. This profound ontological split is a doubling of pain's annihilating power. The lack of acknowledgement and recognition, which at present could act as a form of self-extension, becomes a second form of negation and rejection, the social equivalent of the physical aversiveness. This terrifying dichotomy and doubling is itself redoubled, multiplied, and magnified in torture because instead of the person's pain being subjectively real but unobjectified and invisible to all others, it is now hugely objectified, everywhere visible, as incontestably present in the external as in the internal world, and yet it is simultaneously categorically denied. This denial, the third major step in the sequence on which torture is built, occurs in the translation of all the objectified elements of pain into the insignia of power, the conversion of the enlarged map of human suffering into an emblem of the regime's strength. This translation is made possible by, and occurs across, the phenomenon common to both power and pain, agency. The electric generator, the whips and canes, the torturer's fists, the walls, the doors, the prisoner's sexuality, the torturer's questions, the institution of medicine, the prisoner's screams, his wife and children, the telephone, the chair, a trial, a submarine, the prisoner's eardrums, all these and many more, everything human and inhuman that is either physically or verbally, actually or elusively present, has become part of the glutted realm of weaponry, weaponry that can refer equally to pain or power. What by the one is experienced as a continual contraction is, for the other a continual expansion, for the torturer's growing sense of self is carried outward on the prisoner's swelling pain. As an actual physical fact, a weapon is an object that goes into the body and produces pain. As a perceptual fact, it lifts the pain out of the body and makes it visible, or, more precisely, it acts as a bridge or mechanism across which some of pain's attributes its incontestable reality, its totality, its ability to eclipse all else, its power of dramatic alteration and world dissolution can be lifted away from their source, can be separated from the sufferer and referred to power, broken off from the body and attached instead to the regime. Now, at least for the duration of this obscene and pathetic drama, it is not the pain but the regime that is incontestably real, not the pain but the regime that is total, not the pain but the regime that is able to eclipse all else, not the pain but the regime that is able to dissolve the world. Fraudulent and merciless, this kind of power claims pain's attributes as its own and disclaims the pain itself. The act of disclaiming is as essential to the power as is the act of claiming. It of course assists the torturer in practical ways. He first inflicts pain, then objectifies pain, then denies the pain, and only this final act of self-blinding permits the shift back to the first step, the inflicting of still more pain, for to allow the reality of the other's suffering to enter his own consciousness would immediately compel him to stop the torture. But the bond between the blindness and the power goes far beyond the practical circles of self-amplification. It is not merely that his power makes him blind, nor that his power is accompanied by blindness, nor even that his power requires blindness. It is, instead, quite simply that his blindness, his will immorality, is his power, or a large part of it. This identification becomes almost self-evident when sadistic forms of power are seen in relation to the benign and legitimate forms of power, on which civilization is based. Every act of civilization is an act of transcending the body in a way consonant with the body's needs. In building a wall, to return to an old friend, one overcomes the body, projects oneself out beyond the body's boundaries, but in a way that expresses and fulfills the body's need for stable temperatures. Higher moments of civilization, more elaborate forms of self-extension, occur at a greater distance from the body. The telephone or the airplane is a more emphatic instance of overcoming the limitation of the human body than is the card. Yet even as here one most exhilaratingly defined of the body, civilization always has embedded within it a profound allegiance to the body, for it is only by paying attention that it can free attention. Torture is a condensation of the act of overcoming the body present in benign forms of power. Although the torturer dominates the prisoner both in physical acts and verbal acts, ultimate domination requires that the prisoner's ground become increasingly physical and the torturer's increasingly verbal, that the prisoner become a colossal body with no voice and the torturer a colossal voice, a voice composed of two voices, with no body, that eventually the prisoner experience himself exclusively in terms of sentience and the torturer exclusively in terms of self-extension. All those ways in which the torturer dramatizes his opposition to and distance from the prisoner are ways of dramatizing his distance from the body. The most radical act of distancing resides in his disclaiming of the other's her. Within the strategies of power based on denial there is, as in affirmative and civilized forms of power, a hierarchy of achievement, successive intensifications based on increasing distance from, increasingly great transcendence of, the body. A regime's refusal to recognize the rights of the normal and healthy is its card, its refusal to recognize and care for those in agony is its airplane. This display of the fiction of power, the final product and outcome of torture, should in the end be seen in relation to its origin, the motive that is claimed to be its starting point, the need for information. Torture is not unusual in giving so prominent a place to so false a motive, for, as noted earlier, other acts of political violence within these same governments such as arrest and gratuitous punishment are frequently accompanied by explanations of motive so arbitrary that they seem intended as demonstrations of contempt. Explorations of other historical moments of brutality such as Camus's of the guillotine in France and Arendt's of Hitler's Germany almost inevitably comment on the obvious erroneousness of the asserted motive. The purpose of an execution cannot be deterrence if the execution is never even publicly announced. The war did not cause but permitted Hitler's mass executions. Point 68. This false motive syndrome is not adequately explained by the vocabulary of excuse and rationalization, and its continual recurrence suggests that it has a fixed place in the formal logic of brutality. The motive for torture is to a large extent the equivalent, though in a different logical time, of the fictionalized power. That is, one is the falsification of the pain prior to the pain and one the falsification after the pain. The two together form a closed loop of attention that ensures the exclusion of the prisoners. Human claim. Just as the display of the weapon, or agent or cause, makes it possible to lift the attributes of pain away from the pain, so the display of motive endows agency with agency, cause with cause, thereby lifting the attributes of pain still further away from their source. If displaying the weaponry begins to convert the prisoner's pain into the torturer's power, displaying the motive, and the ongoing interrogation means that it is fairly continually displayed, enables the torturer's power to be understood in terms of his own vulnerability and need. A motive is of course only one way of deflecting the natural reflex of sympathy away from the actual sufferer. According to Arendt in Eichmann in Jerusalem, the speeches of Himmler were full of phrases such as, the order to solve the Jewish question, this was the most frightening order an organization could ever receive, and she explains. Hence the problem was how to overcome not so much their conscience as the animal pity by which all normal men are affected in the presence of physical suffering. The trick used by Himmler, who apparently was rather strongly afflicted with these instinctive reactions himself, was very simple and probably very effective. It consists in turning these instincts around, as it were, in directing them toward the self. So that instead of saying, "What horrible things I did to people," the murderers would be able to say, "What horrible things I had to watch in the pursuance of my duties, how heavily the task weighed upon my shoulders." 69. Concentration camp guards, according to Bruno Bettelheim, repeatedly said to their prisoners, "I'd shoot you with this gun, but you're not worth the 3 pfennig of the bullet," a statement that had so little effect on the prisoners that its constant repetition was unintelligible to Bettelheim until he realized that it had been made part of the SS training because of its impact on the guards themselves. 70. This last example, because it involves an actual weapon, is paradigmatic of the structure of perception that underlies the false motive even when no overt image of the weapon is present. Every weapon has 2 ends. In converting the other person's pain into his own power, the torturer experiences the entire OC currents exclusively from the non-vulnerable end of the weapon. If his attention begins to slip down the weapon toward the vulnerable end, if the severed attributes of pain begin to slip back to their origin in the prisoner's sentience, their backward fall can be stopped, they can be lifted out once more by the presence of the motive. If the guard's awareness begins to follow the path of the bullet, that path itself can be bent so that he himself rather than the prisoner is the bullet's destination. His movement toward a recognition of the internal experience of an exploding head and loss of life is interrupted and redirected toward a recognition of his own loss of 3 pfennig. It does not matter that there is always an extraordinary disjunction between the 2 levels of need between being shot and losing 3 pfennig, between being a victim of the massive concentration camp brutalities and having to watch those brutalities, between extreme and prolonged physical pain of torture and being in need of a piece of information for the work of the false motive is formal, not substantive. It prevents the mind from ever getting to the place where it would have to make such comparisons. Power is cautious. It covers itself. It bases itself in another's pain and prevents all recognition that there is another by locked circles that ensure its own solipsism.